I
Good,
can
thanks.
too.
Great to have all of you here today. I am Jenny Shanker from the Center for Student Success, and we are excited to be looking at the series of resources created by our friends at the National Center for Inquiry and Improvement. Before I turn it over to them, though, I just want to do some quick housekeeping and framing. One is, of course, I am, as per usual, joined by my fabulous colleagues. Katie is here, Erica's joining us, Precious may be on the line as well. We are happy to be bringing this webinar, another one of our many, many virtual resources to you today. As you know, we have a number of ways to for you to engage, and we would love it if you could rename yourself to include your college, so that particularly for our guests, they'll know who's talking, or sharing. We'll know who's there. Use the chat to ask questions. Not everybody uses that all the time. So don't know what you do. You position your cursor in the box, you type what you're going to type, and then you hit enter, and the chat goes forward. Ooh, that didn't sound good. And then we will also be sharing, Katie, our tweeter-in-chief, will be sharing insights on Twitter as we go through the presentation. So please join us on Twitter and see what Katie is saying about you. We have other events coming up. The mcca.org events page is your very best friend for those events. Calling attention to a couple of them, we have some faculty roundtables coming up, which is, we have the My Start to Finish faculty roundtable on October 20th, which is primarily for faculty teaching developmental education. And then our fall faculty roundtable series, which is a follow-up from the work that we did this summer. Some of you probably were part of those roundtables from the summer. We're going to continue kind of talking about teaching in and learning in this new world for a series of 3 Mondays in a row. Again, mcca.org events. And these will be not discipline specific as they were in the summer, but will be, we'll have some cross-discipline conversations, and then we'll break into discipline groups depending on the size of the group that we have for each one. And then finally, speaking of Twitter, join us for our MCSS Equity Tweet Chats, very relevant to this presentation today. On October 29th and November 17th, we'll be chatting about equity. Follow us on Twitter for more information, and those are great. You don't have to register, you just join us on Twitter and read the question and join the conversation. So that's really all that I had to say. Are there any questions for us at MCSS before I turn it over to Priya and Rob? All right, I'm not hearing any. Rob, so do you want to go ahead and share your slides?
Yes, I do. And I will do that. Hello, everybody. I am going to be sharing these. I think Priya is going to kick us off here, but let me get the share. Actually, I want to share the screen because I want to go back and forth. All right, we looking good there?
Looking good.
Cool. Greetings, all right, Priya, you want to kick us off?
No, go for it, Rob.
Okay, cool. Well, welcome everybody. It's good to see a lot of familiar names and faces on the participant list, and we are happy to be back in Michigan again, this time with a new kind of topic I think that we will be talking about with you today. And yes, in response to the chat, we will give you, these slides will be available to you, as will the video clips we're about to play. And so we're going to tell you a little bit of a story of this Equity Through Guided Pathways guide series. The journey we've been on with these over the last, actually barely a year now, seems like a much longer period of time, and releasing these to the field in April and then re-releasing them in June. But this was, the overview here is that we're going to kind of introduce the guides. We're actually going to play a brief video clip from the guides first. And then we're going to introduce the guides, kind of how we got there, and also then introduce the specific guides with kind of playing a little with one or two of them. And then we are also going to move into small group discussions. This is a set of resources that we've developed with some great partners around the country. We'll tell you about that in a second, to help start conversations. Obviously, if we started this a little over a year ago, the backdrop to this was not after the racist killings of the spring, and the response to it and uprising around the country and the reckoning that we're all going through with many of these issues. This was started before that. This was actually born out of a long-held desire to connect more intentionally the equity space and the guided pathways space. Well, we'll talk about this in a second. While guided pathways was always formed with equity in mind, there are some lenses of equity to the guided pathways journey that we think are very specific, and we wanted to bring together a group of people to help address them here. So we will get to that, but just to kind of kick things off, we're going to play a couple of video clips today. They are from a webinar we did this summer. It was the first webinar after the guides were released about the notions of equity from a Black CEO, Michael Baston of SUNY Rockland, who's one of our close friends, and from a white CEO, Bill Scroggins of Mount San Antonio College in Walnut, California, where Priya actually both went and then worked first. She has deep connections to that college. And we'll tell you more about the story of how the guides, each of them came to be. But first, we're going to start with a clip from Michael Baston, and then Priya is going to introduce the guide. So we're going to make this work. We already tested it once. It's going to work. So everyone just say it's going to work.
Love what Bill said, because the idea of getting the supportive community, you know, is essential. I am so grateful to our board of trustees, because they have been bold. You know, they're passing a resolution that really speaks to supporting the work of really, and saying, you know, in their resolution that says we will work along.
Looking and sounding okay, Rob.
All right, here we go.
Rob,
Can't hear
whatever
you.
first was working better. Now we can't hear him. Rob, can you hear us?
I bet he muted himself thinking the video would play, but it won't if he's muted.
Now he's leaving.
Rob. Now we can watch Rob read the comments in the chat log.
Technology works until it doesn't.
Oh
Oh
No, he does not get it.
no.
I'm gonna call.
I assume someone texted him.
I just texted him. I'm gonna just
Okay.
hold. You guys can't read Michael's lips? Please try.
He's such a phenomenal speaker,
He
though.
does.
I'm so excited that you guys have him in the session.
We have a video of this actually.
Okay,
I was just thinking. Yeah, I was just thinking I've seen this before, so.
We may have shared a clip of it at another Michigan event recently. And we're going to share the full panel discussion with you. These are just excerpts that might kind of orient the conversation we're going to have today better.
Okay, can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay, let's try this again.
Whatever you had done first was great. Yeah.
All right, let's try this again right now. And Priya, text me again if this doesn't work, because it worked fine when Jenny and I tested it like 5 minutes before this all started. So
It
we're
was
gonna try
working
again.
again the first time.
Yeah, I know. All right, here we go.
Share your screen.
Thanks, Beverly.
Yeah, good Lord, this morning. What is the, it's not like I haven't done this before. All right, let's do that first. We should share the screen first. All right, here we go. Screen, share. All right, now we're gonna try.
Love what Bill said, because the idea
Yes,
of
perfect.
getting the supportive community, is essential. I am so grateful
Can you
to our
turn it up a
board of
little?
trustees, because they have been bold. They're passing a resolution that really speaks to supporting the work of really, and saying, in their resolution that says we will work alongside the faculty, the staff, and the students as we seek to become a more an equitably inclusive and an equitably excellent and inclusive excellent institution. Like, I love that, the fact that we're working directly with our county commission for human rights to sort of be the educational partner for the Commission of Human Rights in our county is very powerful, because what you're saying is that word community in your title really truly means something, that you're actually creating sort of this environment where we all say it's not white versus black, it's everyone versus racism. And this is sort of, the more we understand that this is everybody's responsibility, and that everybody has to understand what we're talking about in terms of implicit bias, and how that implicit bias is driven by the kind of outcomes that were produced by laws in this country. It is the laws that created the outcomes that have led to these bad narratives. And we as a country, even though the laws have changed, we have not changed every man's and every woman's heart on these issues. And so that's why I'm inspired and I'm encouraged about what we see in the country today with our young people who are of all races, all ages, all backgrounds, all experiences, all those who are standing up and saying we have to fight all isms and all phobias. And this is the moment to say that we are going to collectively stand up to the things that divide us as we build bridges to each other.
Thank you, Rob. And like I had mentioned, we will share this entire conversation with you in the chat so that you can go ahead and listen to the conversation that led to this clip, as well as the conversation that ensued. I kind of want to begin our conversation around what do we mean when we talk about equity in guided pathways? We have collectively been working on guided pathways in colleges around the country for over a decade. And while it has been implied that equity has been at the center of guided pathways, we in the last couple of years wanted to really challenge what does it mean for equity to be at the center, and what does it look like to operationalize guided pathways in an equity-minded and equity-focused kind of way. And so even though we are grounded in this desire for equity, pathways in and of themselves don't equal equity. And in fact, depending on how they're designed or redesigned, they may perpetuate certain forms of inequity that we are actively trying to address. And so this notion of seeing how different groups of students experience the same types of practices, policies, processes, and have different types of impact is what we want to talk about. And really, we're trying to focus less on what the intention of our institutions is, what we cross our fingers and hope happens as we design very dutifully our efforts, but really what happens from the student's perspective, and how different groups of student populations actually experience those types of practices separately. The other piece around this is that even though we individually don't want to seek and do harm on our students, sometimes the way that our structures have been built and have been maintained automatically do that. And so it is not necessarily about doing more. It might just be also about dismantling and undoing systems that are kind of ensuring inequitable practices. The other piece I want to stress here, and Rob and I are going to talk a little bit more about this, is that one automatic thing that we can try to do is ensure that every time we talk about student populations, we actively do data disaggregation, which means breaking it out so that we understand how different populations are being impacted by the same efforts. And in the same breath, I want to say that data disaggregation isn't also the end of the story. Rob, would you mind closing or moving your chat windows?
We're hitting it on all cylinders today. It's my first day on Zoom, actually, so we're good today. Yeah, it's awesome.
All good. So really it's this balance of intentional mindsets, both from a structural point at the institution as well as through our own individual work. And really, like, one way to talk about equity is almost like, how can we ensure that a student's success is not predictable by factors like race or gender or other types of demographics?
Right, and Priya, one of the things that you'll hear later from Bill Scroggins, and you heard it a little bit from Michael, this notion of, we all talk about disaggregating data. And I think one of the points here is that disaggregating data is not the last step, it's the first step in an inquiry process. And Bill's going to talk about this a little bit. Priya and I have done a lot of work back in a previous incarnation of ourselves on this notion of what does a culture of inquiry actually look like. And asking research questions, getting the data, disaggregating the data are really steps 1 and 2 of the process, and really understanding and trying to derive insight from the data. Bill has a suggestion for that as well, is a very important part of the process. And so the other thing you heard from Michael that I think it's important to know as a backdrop is Michael is a lawyer in addition to being a community college president. So he has a deep knowledge of the legal implications of some of the laws that caused racist outcomes. And you also hear from Bill a story about the 13th Amendment and students talking about indentured servitude, which was, so the intersection between these policies, which in many cases, as Priya said, solved one problem, may have unintentionally set up others. And I think that's one of the big pieces of equity work, is looking at what well-intended and perhaps successful policies for the problem they were trying to solve to the dominant group that was in the mind's eye of the people who were solving the problem may have unintentionally created these other problems. And so I just want to double down on Priya's kind of statement there, that this is not to say we intentionally created these policies, but we do have to look at what we need to do to understand the effects of those policies and systems and cultures on students, and that disaggregating data is a key first step. I've talked with a number of folks in the last couple of days and weeks around the intersection between guided pathways and equity and the student experience, and this idea that you need all 3 of these things working together to really produce the outcomes you want. And we're going to talk about this in a second as well.
So we wanted to just share a little bit of background on how these guides came to be. Supposedly, it was only a year and a few months ago, but it feels like decades ago. Last summer, we convened a group of national leaders of color around the topics of equity, racial equity, guided pathways. And the charge was, when you think of the intersection of equity and guided pathways, what types of issues and priorities come to mind? Like, how can we make real those types of intersections? And so that in-person meeting, which again sounds so foreign, but in that in-person meeting, there were over, I think, 24 examples of what does it mean to have an equity-centered guided pathways approach at different phases of the work, different areas of the work came out. And so following that convening, we identified around the top dozen and charged each of the participants with authoring a short discussion guide that would introduce others to that priority area. And so for each of these intersections of equity and guided pathways, which we'll share the list of, we have 2 resources developed. One is a 3 to 4 page guide that does a brief introduction of the issue. It is not meant to be comprehensive. In fact, it's meant to just serve as an invitation for you and your colleagues to just start considering what that intersection looks like. And then we also have for each guide 3 to 5 questions that can advance discussions around that topic further, and also some research tasks or data tasks that you can do to better understand what that issue might look like in your own college and in your own context. Along with these guides, which are really, really brief, we also have slide decks that translate a lot of the highlights of the guides into slides that you can also pull and put into whichever conversations you're already having in your committees, in your departments, in your work groups that might advance the equity mindedness in the work that you're doing, whether it's on onboarding or program mapping or thinking about improving the student's sense of connection and belonging to the campus, especially during this time. You can go ahead and use any parts of these and make them work for the context that you have. We released these guides in April, and they're all available. Katie shared the link already. They're all available for you to use. And what we want to do today is just introduce you to the 11 guides that make up the series, and then also offer you a chance to kind of go into small discussions with other colleagues around what this might mean for your own college context.
Yeah, and just to share just a couple thoughts from, Priya was actually a participant in that convening, one of the 20 leaders, and Kay McClenny and I were listeners, and we really just listened for the whole session. Nikki Edgecombe from CCRC was our facilitator. And I think a couple of notes on this. One, this list of topics is not meant to be definitive in any way. This was a prioritized list by the 20 people who were in this room who were tasked with this intersection between equity and guided pathways. Another thing that this is not, is never was intended to be and isn't, is an equity framework. There are many equity frameworks. You can use critical race theory. You can use any of the number of equity frameworks with which to look at your work and your practice, and your policies. What these are a chance to use an equity lens on key aspects of the student experience at different stages of the guided pathways journey. And we're about to talk about that, but I do think it's important to note that this was not intended to be, nor is it an equity framework. What it is are specific lenses and discussion starters, if you will, that you could use any equity framework you wanted to investigate on your campus. And as Priya said, these are meant to start conversations, not end them, right? The entire goal here is to just give you enough of some content to start some conversations. One of the things that Linda Garcia says in this webinar that we're sharing is that one of the hardest things to do is start these conversations on a campus. We all say, Michael in different pieces of the presentation says we need to take steps beyond statements. We've all made the statements. We are anti-racist, our college does not stand for racism. Everyone's made the statements. How do you take the next steps beyond those statements? And I think that's what we've tried to do, and really these authors have tried to do with these guides. They are written in different voices because the authors wrote them in their own voice, right? And so some of them are more forward with certain race ideas and some of them are less, and they're perfectly fine. Like, they all raise the same issues, and we are, I think that you'll find an interesting range, and they resonate with people differently, which we think is great. That's why there are 11 of them. So we will get to kind of exploring them right momentarily. And
Yeah.
Priya,
Or we could just
I'll
talk about them for sure.
yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about data disaggregation already. And the primacy of race in these conversations is probably never more at our forefront of our minds than it is right now after the events of the last 4 or 5 months. Shouldn't have taken those events probably to do that, but we need to use the opportunity we have. We are able to say that things like anti-racism now that we probably couldn't have done 3 or 4 years ago in the ways that we can now. And there's a reckoning right now that we're all engaged in. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to use that to move things forward. And so we do talk about the primacy of race in these discussions, but it is not the only ism, as you'll hear from Michael in a second.
One other thing to quickly note is that what we are sharing with you is meant to be used in concert with many of the other organizations around the country that are doing this work day in and day out. There are so many incredible resources from USC's Center for Urban Education that actually put out all of their racial equity tools for public use. There's also the healing centers that are put forward by AAC&U. And there's just an incredible amount of work, what we wanted to do with this work is really kind of focus on the relationship between equity and guided pathways, because I think that is still fairly nascent. And like Rob mentioned, we are already considering additional guides to add to this as well. And as you go through this with us today, if there are other intersections that you've already experienced or you know to be valuable, feel free to share them with us, because we would be totally interested in expanding our kind of shared field knowledge around this work as well.
Great.
Next. So let's talk a little bit about how we organize this. Many of us might be familiar with the 4 pillars of guided pathways. What we wanted to focus the equity guides on was from the student's perspective and the student impact, which I mentioned. And we thought that the lost momentum frameworks that was put forward through Completion by Design, an initiative for almost a decade ago, may actually resonate more. So Rob, if you want to go to the next slide, I can share a little bit of the relationship between these 2 frameworks. So the Guided Pathways framework is based on 4 pillars around clarifying the paths for students, helping students get on the path, helping students stay on this path, and ensuring that students are learning. And if you notice the verb usage, the subject is actually the institution. So these are all things institutions can do in service of student access, progress, and success. The other framework, Lost Momentum framework, is really from the student's experience and organizes that student experience into 4 phases. How a student connects to the college, how the student experiences the onboarding phase, which would be the entry phase, how a student continues to make progress and completes whatever their educational goal is, whether it is certain training within the college, advanced training at a university, entering the workforce, whatever it may be. And then the advancement phase kind of focuses on that transition as well. But the Lost Momentum framework is from the student's perspective, and the Guided Pathways framework is from the institution's perspective. Rob, would you mind, it might be the chat box, right, that is hovering over phase, the 4th pillar?
Phase 4, it's actually not that, it is.
Oh, exciting
Okay.
time. There we go.
All right.
Thank you all. So yeah, so these are the frameworks that we wanted to play around with, and we thought that focusing it from the student's perspective would ensure that it would be centered in the impact our activities have on the students. Next.
Okay, so we're going to go through the guides. They're really in 3 sections here. The first guide is an institutional self-assessment. Our friends at the United Negro College Fund, Andrea Njoku and Deshaun Preston, who we met through the Pathways Collaborative, helped author a guide that is an institutional self-assessment. And I'm actually going to come out of PowerPoint to show this to you really quickly, because this is a great place to start. It is that we tasked, and I was a secondary author on this, or tertiary in this case, we tasked Andrea and Deshaun with putting together a short assessment. They have an introduction here. You'll see this in all of the guides. There's always a how to use this guide. There's some text and an introduction. And in this case, rather than moving to discussion questions right away, we have a self-assessment instrument. And this is a fairly common 5-point Likert type scale, and it goes through a list of the equitable practices that they have identified at the intersection between equity and guided pathways. Number 1 talks about a clear definition of equity. We do distinguish between race, class, and gender equity. We talk about disaggregation, those kind of initial stages. This number 4 is a really, really unlikely one to be true and very controversial in a lot of places. But also we know deeply the research on how faculty, staff, and administrators modeling the student institution population, especially from historically marginalized groups, is a huge positive effect for students. And while I certainly believe that my white colleagues and I as a white man can be helpful and allies in the fight for equity, I also believe that the fact that 82% of community college faculty nationally are white when almost 50% of our students are of color is a problem. And so we actually have a guide based on that, but this is one of the equitable practices in here. We talk about equity training, also the process of learning, disaggregating data. You even see it in number 6, what we were talking about earlier, questioning assumptions in terms of equity. Partnerships about the pipelines for underserved populations, ensuring that there's a focus on exploring educational and career options, cost of programs, likely wages. You see the focus of number 8 comes up in a number of our materials from NCII and around the country, this notion of understanding the cost of programs and what's the likely return in the marketplace after they complete. Kind of assessment of participation in high impact programs. Our colleague Tia McNair from AAC&U, they have a lot of research on high impact programs, and a lot of that research also shows that some of the students who might benefit the most from it and need it the most, historically marginalized populations, also don't participate in those at the same levels as their white counterparts. Talking about learning differences in number 10, and then the notion of culturally responsive pedagogy. So it's just a way to kind of take a little bit of a self-assessment. We got some discussion questions here. And so this is an example of one of the guides. This one's a little bit different than the rest of them because it actually has a self-assessment built into it. But that's an example of one of the guides. And so that's the first guide. And Priya, you want to take the second, the 2, 3, and 4? Actually, I'll do these, Priya, and then you can take the next 7. Because one of the things when we went into that meeting last July that I thought was going to be really interesting as a white male doing work around equity and the intersection with pathways is how do you lead conversations on equity as a white leader or a white CEO? And I mentioned that was one of the very few times I spoke in that meeting. I mentioned that idea, and Michael Baston, who you saw in the video, said, Rob, you should absolutely write that guide. That would be a very valuable guide for the field on how white leaders can be allies in the fight against racism and to promote equity. But you also got to write one for leaders of color, because it is not as easy for us either. And we face unique challenges as leaders of color. And actually, what we then decided to do is write both guides. So Michael authored the one on leading culture change to promote equity as a CEO of color, and Bill Scroggins wrote it as leading it as a white CEO. While these were written kind of for the CEO audience, they are very relevant to leadership throughout the organization, whether you are in management, frontline student services, or faculty. The notion of leadership is distributive in our view. And these ideas that you hear from Michael and Bill in those 2 guides are really transcend just the CEO role. And the 4th guide, we talked a little bit about faculty diversity. You see it in the self-assessment. A lot of colleges talk about wanting to improve faculty diversity. And then again, we don't have a lot of strategies to get there. Ed Bush, the president from Sumnus River in California, takes a look at this. And along with Kay McClenny, introducing it, takes a look at the things you need to do to disrupt your current processes to produce more equitable outcomes in terms of faculty diversity. So the first guide's kind of a self-assessment. The second 3 guides, numbers 2 through 4, are really about leadership. And then Priya can go through the guides that are much more focused on the student experience.
And you may, in some ways, an easier time applying these to the work that you're doing, since many times we are focused on practical, operational kind of translations. And so the first one, number 5, is around supporting students from application through the first day of classes. And this one is really looking at that onboarding experience. And it's up to you and your institution how far you define it. Sometimes they do it just, colleges do it just to the first day of classes. In other times it can be more expansive, and we kind of support that about expanding into the first semester or even to the first year. But this guide looks at equity issues related to how students are placed into remedial education, how those sequences affect their ability to make timely progress on their educational goals, looking at issues around financial aid. I mean, we could spend a lot of time around how the financial aid process has aspects in there, if you look at the verification process, that inequitably impact different groups of students differently in accessing the supports they need to be able to get the supplies they need for their class, for example. Guide 6 talks a little bit about creating that sense of connection and belonging once students enter. And I would argue that given the state of affairs in the last 6 months, this is really, really important. From what we have learned directly from students, as well as from those who work with students, having some sense of connection, ongoing check-in is helpful for people just to know that the college is thinking about them and sees them and recognizes them. So issues in this guide include talking about communication, how we actually communicate with our students and what we are explicitly saying and implicitly saying. It talks about ways to really connect students through different types of communities, holistic supports, but it really talks about this large notion of creating and sustaining a sense of connection to the campus where students feel validated.
And one note here, Priya, is that we are amassing a library of these video webinars from the authors talking about their guides and the issues within those guides. obviously Michael and Bill are the ones we're using today. We have Tia McNair with some thoughts on guide number 10 coming up, but these two are actually both going to have videos, webinars produced, one today, actually for number 5, for a college in California, and number 6 in a couple of weeks. And so over time, you can look back to the link we send you for additional videos. And we hope to get to all 11 by sometime in the early spring, where we have the authors speaking freely about, live about these issues. And so we'll have Juliana Barnes and a colleague of hers today, and we'll have that video up by the end of the week.
Thanks, Rob. The next one was one that I co-authored around how we can move from a student deficit mindset to a more asset-based mindset around students. And this guide specifically looks at the onboarding as just one practical application of having an asset-based approach, but it's centered in two pieces of research. One is Dr. Laura Rendon's validation theory, and the other is Dr. Carol Dweck's growth mindset, really about how we can recognize the lived experiences of students as valid and as them being experts in their own experiences that can actually be a boon for them and for the institution instead of vice versa. The next guide is really looking at this notion of math and reading, specifically looking at what are the gaps that different student groups face when it comes to placement, when it comes to remedial coursework, long sequences, biases in our tests, and really looking at what are some strategies like co-requisite models, acceleration, contextualization that can really support the ability of students to complete their transfer level math and English coursework in the first year, which is the standard we're aspiring to. In number 9, we're really talking about classroom instruction and thinking about how classroom instruction can be assessed and reflected on as a space where students can really be validated and centered in their own learning. So thinking about implicit bias, thinking about what do we do right now that acknowledges the complex identities of students in the classroom, and where are opportunities for us to be able to support that in the classroom. So there's also a bit around different types of professional development and different types of learning philosophies that can be used. Guide number 10, Rob kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, even in the self-assessment from guide 1 around what it would take to create more active learning opportunities for students, as well as culturally responsive teaching and learning. The one thing I do want to mention while I go through these is that these standalone guides, if we were to actually visualize all the guides, there is a tremendous amount of overlap, because it reminds me of that John Muir quote about when you see things in nature, you realize that they're all kind of inextricably linked, and these guides are no exception. So even in the guides, we'll say, oh, if you're interested in guide 10, you might be interested in guide 5 and guide 1. So just recognize that there are some overlapping concepts in these guides that might serve you as well. And then guide 11 is looking at non-academic supports. And this is where our colleague Linda Garcia and I focused around areas of how do you nurture an academic mindset for students? How do you think about the non-academic, and I put that in quotes because I don't believe they're non-academic, they may be non-curricular, but needs like food, housing, technology, childcare, all the real life stuff that affects the ability of students to focus on their academics. So that guide talks a little bit about outside of the curricular experiences, what other considerations equity-wise exist. So we just went through all 11 of them in very, very speedy fashion. Rob, do we want to take a quick break and see if people have questions, or do you want to move to?
Yeah, I think so. I think we have a couple of video clips we can show you at the end here. And I think it will help if everyone is on mute except for me here. That may help a little bit with the sound, because we tested it earlier and it seemed to work fine then. So if everyone else can mute, we've got 2 more video clips. They're about 3 and 2 minutes each. And we will then kind of come back with some questions and actually send you out to talk about these in a second. So here is Bill Scroggins about digging deeper as you look at equity on your campus.
Michael, that's good. Bill, let me do a follow-up question with you, because you talk about digging in deep. So the challenge of unconscious bias is that it's just unconscious. So, what have been some effective strategies for helping people to dig in deep and just examine the beliefs and behaviors of others' experiences with the racial unjust? How do you go about doing that?
So um, I think there's not just one way of doing that. I think there has to be an overall change in the campus climate to be willing to look at what the college is doing. And so when I started on this digging deeper, I have the opportunity with our convocation days to have all of the faculty and most of the management team participate in this day of training. And I worked with the faculty to bring in some disruptive opportunities. We have a readers theater, and there was a group of Black students who wanted to do a readers theater based on the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which it allows indentured servitude, which has been one of the reasons that so many Black men are in prison. So these Black men erected a prison on the stage and read from Black writers about this issue of the imprisonment of Blacks and what it meant for the true meaning of the Constitution. This was very disruptive. I brought in a woman who is a neuroscientist and also trains judges on how to avoid bias. And she had some group opportunities showing pictures of stereotypical circumstances, and then having the audience clap about which one they reacted more positively to, just intuitively. You could hear the bias in the room, the Western European white stereotypes getting the positive reaction. So that woke people up, but that's not enough. You have to do more than that. So we began to change the way we looked at data. We were disaggregating data and not looking at the next step, having focus groups of students to tell us why that existed, and then have students talk about that and write about that. So the voice of students and using data properly is a good step forward.
You hear from Bill there that the notion of disruption. You also hear the notion of not just disaggregating data, but getting deeper and really kind of exploring some of the issues that the data raises. And here's Michael with one final clip, kind of bringing some of this home and tying equity and guided pathways together.
So this is a follow-up question. So Michael, how do you bring the community into this conversation when maybe they're not used to having that? And especially with a CEO of color, like you said, you have to maybe choose your moments. But we always want people to be brave and to always take that step. But if you're kind of doubting or thinking or contemplating, how do you bring these people into this conversation, considering a person who has experienced these maybe inequities or have been in this situation or challenges? How do you bring those folks into the conversation without maybe if you're walking on eggshells, maybe feeling like that? How do you handle all that?
Well, I think part of the strategy that we used was to say, well, what is the framework that we're operating in? And we, in our campus, chose to operate within the Guided Pathways framework. So it gave us a really good sort of framework, most specifically the lost momentum framework from completion by design, because now we use that in Guided Pathways. It allows us to use it as a template for addressing equity issues, as you'll see in the guides that we have through this Equity Guides series. It allows us to say, hey, we can use metrics not only for the student experience, you could also use metrics in the employee experience, because connection, entry, progress, and completion actually can fit in nicely with any way to have meaningful dialogues. The other thing is you've got to engage people in sort of meaningful collaborations. one of the greatest things that we did, I think, at Rockland with our work around guided pathways is that it was a bottom-up experience, and it was an integrated experience, and it was an experience from folks throughout all levels. So we want to replicate that good work because it actually has created that momentum for us of collaboration, so that we're building that culture of collaboration that will help us become what we want to be, which is a more inclusively excellent institution. What can you argue with? The inclusion or the excellence? You know, so but the opportunity to finally have these kinds of conversations. There are some of my white faculty and staff members that have said to me, you know, I never knew that my Black colleagues felt that way. They didn't, because there was never a reason for us to have those kind of conversations. Taco Tuesday is not diversity. You know,
Right.
having an event for Black History Month and the Spanish Month, and we're going to have St. Patrick's Day and Columbus Day. Like, just because we have those cultural activities, that's not true diversity, inclusion, and equity work. That is an element of creating an inclusive community. So I think we've got to be thinking very deeply. And we, at our campus, we have been very, very transparent. We have lifted and elevated voices. And as the president, you know, you do have to create an environment. Honestly, I could not have started my work at Rockland with equity. We couldn't start it with that because we had to get things in order to move it forward as an institution. We had to kind of, you know, take off. But because we did that work of building the culture of collaboration, now our work in equity can move forward and can advance our institution. So you have to, you know, that this is where in my art, my guide, I talk about, you know, emotional intelligence. It is understanding, you know, how you perceive yourself, how others perceive you, by really recognizing that you can't just be doing talking, you have to listen. I've done a lot of listening. And when I have been wrong on an issue, we had to hit the reset button on something. I was very open and honest about that because that's how you build trust.
All right, so let's come back here. So you can see why we showed you those videos. They're both such wonderfully insightful people, and they're deep conversations here that we think are really, really useful. And so coming back together, we're going to break you out in a second. We want to open it up now for any questions you have about the guide series, anything you heard. I think this one thing we know is this is a lot. It's a lot to take in a very short period of time. We actually like to give you some of the small group discussion space to have that space for exploring it with a small group of peers. But if there are any questions or observations now, we can do that for a couple of minutes before breaking you out for maybe a half hour or so to have these conversations with your peers from across the state. We have a relatively small number of folks today, so may only have 3 or 4 groups, but I do think it's still worth having a smaller opportunity to have these conversations. Any questions for the group? We also, by the way, know it's hard to ask questions about this topic into a large group of people. So we are not going to have any worries if there are no questions here. But if you do have questions, you can either fire them into chat or unmute yourself at this time. Priya, while people are coming in, anything as you saw those clips that like came to you, I know we were there the first time, but as you think about it in this context of introducing the guides today, how do you reflect on them? And you're muted.
I tend to think about them in the context of what's already being done at the institution. So these are not meant to be new and different. They're really meant to be aids in framing the conversations that may already be happening. And so you may not, in terms of like how to actually use them, you may not necessarily pick an entire guide up and weave it into something you're doing. It may just be a couple of questions or a couple of data pieces from the research tasks that might be really critical. But I think the notion of figuring out what does this look like in the student experience and who is being included and who is being excluded from our practices. The other piece, I know we're focused so much on the student, but especially the last 6 months have taught us that we can't exclusively focus on them, that part of it is about making sure that those who work directly with students and those who support those who work directly with students also have the types of supports and spaces for conversations to be able to ensure that these are taking place. So, Rob, you may want to move your two.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening today, why the today has decided that that's like when showing PowerPoint, because I've done this a couple times now. So anyway, I will hide the video pieces of it.
I think it's a metaphor, Rob. We all wear
Yeah, it's clearly a metaphor.
We wear blinders that cover.
Right. Someone is trying to block equity conversations. Yes, I understand. It's not me, I guarantee you. So I think people are processing this right now. We don't see or hear any questions. So I think what we would like to do is Jenny is going to send you into some breakout rooms, and here are the questions, and I will actually Jenny will rebroadcast these since I'm not host, these into the breakout rooms. We'd love you to briefly introduce yourselves to each other and just reflect on the guides and the video clips, what resonated with you, and more importantly, after the resonance, maybe how could you use these guides at your college? Which conversations or issues or which guides perhaps could really be relevant to you. We're gonna do a very informal report out kind of as we come back together, maybe about 20 after the hour or 22 after the hour, and we'll give you a 3-minute warning and then a 1-minute warning. But we'd love for you to have discussions about this with your peers. And without any further ado, I will stop sharing and let Jenny break everyone out. And we will again rebroadcast those 3 discussion questions into your breakout rooms. So thank you and have good conversations. We'll see you at roughly 20 after the hour.
Thanks, Rob. I just wanted to quickly jump in and add one more question to that, which is how do you think that some of these guides could be applicable to your work within the context of initiatives that you're working on with the Center for Student Success? So within MyBest, within My Start to Finish, within guided pathways, within transfer conversations, what might you be able to use? So I just wanted to throw that to everybody before I